Hi, and welcome to Hope Church Online. My name is Jason. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope, and we just thank you so much for spending time with us today, whether you are listening to this with your community group or watching it, or maybe listening to it via podcast or whatever the case may be. We are just so grateful that you are spending these few moments with us. I'm really excited about today for two reasons. One, this is the end of our sermon series, On Earth as in Heaven, and I'm really excited about what God has to say to us today. We're going to go deep, and we're going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting, so you're probably going to want to get your notebook out so you can take notes and kind of journal along with us. But the other reason I'm very excited is because next week, we are actually going to be meeting face to masked face. Like, we're going to be able to see each other eyeball to eyeball, no longer via computer or iPad or podcast. Like, I'm very, very excited about this. If you want more information, you can go to our website, or you can go to our Facebook page or Instagram page, where we are going to give you information on what to do, the steps to take, and how to move forward. But just be ready. I'm super excited about this as Jimmy and the band lead us in worship next Sunday. Now, that said, we are in the last week of our 9-week series called On Earth as in Heaven, and it's the conversation surrounding our vision statement. As a recap, our vision is we exist to bring hope to our community by practicing the way of Jesus until it is in Nashville as it is in heaven. And we've been looking at a lot of different aspects of what this looks like, specifically over the past 2 weeks and then today at the process of spiritual formation, or what does it look like to grow as a follower of Jesus. Now, as a recap, in John 15, Jesus says he is the vine and we are the branches. And if you know anything about vineyard life or any kind of agricultural setting, you recognize that for a vine and branches to produce good, healthy, abundant fruit, it needs to grow along what's called a trellis. A trellis is a structure many times made out of wood or metal or something else that helps to sort of guide in the growth of that plant. It gets it off the ground and into the air so that the maximum amount of fruit can be produced. And what we said was that God in our lives creates a trellis of sorts. He does it through sort of the intersection of his spirit at work in our passions and our power and in our relationships, which we talked about last week. Well, today what I want to do is I want to give you somewhat of a map to help you navigate through this spiritual growth. So many times it's easy to feel confused or lost or stuck, and you don't really know, am I progressing? Am I regressing? Where am I in the journey? Like, am I even a follower? Like, what in the world is going on? And so what I want to do today is I want to kind of lay out sort of a simple topographical map for you to go, oh, man, this is how I can plot out the terrain around me and where I need to go, maybe what I need to cut out, maybe what I need to press into, what I need to deal with, or what I need to celebrate in order to be able to move forward in the spiritual journey. Now, the reality is that all of us at some point in our life will feel stuck, right? We kind of enter in these places that the brilliant and late theologian Dr. Seuss calls the waiting place in his book, Oh, the Places You Will Go. He says the waiting place is a place for people just waiting for a train to go or a bus to come, or a plane to go, or the mail to come, or the rain to go, or the phone to ring, or the snow to snow, or the waiting around for a yes or no, or waiting for their hair to grow. Everyone is just waiting. Now, I'm not sure where you are in your season of life, but if you are not in the waiting place right now, you either have been, or at some point in the near future, you will be. Now, you may be waiting around for a yes or a no, or you may be waiting for the doctor to give you some good news, or you may be simply waiting for your hair to grow, as Dr. Seuss says. But all of us enter into a season of life where we are just waiting. And it's in this waiting period, this feeling of stuckness, that I think God wants to speak to us and can give us a great deal of spiritual growth and maturity and joy and peace as we are following him in our everyday life. Now, to do that, let's look at John chapter 21, and we're going to start in verse 15. This is a conversation that John is having with his friend Peter. This is after the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. If you remember Peter's story a little bit earlier in chapter 18, you can go back and read it later. Peter actually denies knowing Jesus when he's on trial and he's being tortured and martyred. 3 times different people ask him, hey, aren't you with that Jesus guy? And he's like, I don't know the guy. I've never seen him. Like, stop asking me these questions. 3 times. And then each time it kind of gets progressively worse. And then Jesus dies. Peter feels a great sense of guilt and remorse and despair and doubt even about his own journey. And then we pick up after the resurrection in John chapter 21, this conversation between Jesus and Peter says this. Verse 15, when they had finished breakfast, John said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? These are the fish that he's talking about. Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. A second time, he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Let me just say real quick, in the process of restoration, isn't it interesting that you can still feel hurt, but yet restoration? Anyway, verse 18, Jesus keeps going. He says, very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after this, he said to him, follow me. Now, there's 2 things about this passage that I want to highlight before we kind of go further along in this journey. The first thing is what Jesus says to Peter that I think he says to each one of us, and it's this: you will be led. The reality of Peter's situation and ours is that somebody else is calling the shots in our life. Now, we kind of right now in our postmodern culture are obsessed with sort of this self-help era, right? We listen to podcasts, we watch TED Talks, we do all of these things that kind of say that you are in control of your life. And to some extent, we are in control of certain things. But the lie is that we are in control of everything, or that we can be in control of everything. A great quote by Ronald Rolheiser, whom I quoted last week, was this. He says that we know abstractly that we are vulnerable, but generally we feel pretty secure. He says, but as the coronavirus spreads, we are much more aware that we all live at the mercies of a million contingencies, mostly over which we have little control. Right? If the recent pandemic has taught us one thing, if it's taught us anything, it is that we are not in control nearly as much as we think we are. And what Jesus does here with Peter, and to us metaphorically, is that he shows him that he is a sheep that is being led by something else. Right? We talked about this early on in the conversation of spiritual formation, right? And we said that the question isn't, are we being formed? But what is doing the forming, and what are we being formed into? And that's exactly what Jesus is getting at here. He's saying, Peter, you are going to be led. And this is a terrifying reality. Like, when we recognize that we are not in control of our lives, it is absolutely terrifying and creates a great deal of fear in us unless we are a follower of Jesus. And we press into this idea of what Psalm 23 says, is that the Lord, that Jesus is our shepherd and we lack nothing. You know, when we talk about lacking nothing, and we talk about being out of control and trusting in Jesus, like, I'm not trying to sort of harp on some sort of a colloquialism or some kind of cliche, right? I'm not saying that God is in control of everything that happens to you or around you. What I'm saying is this, that there are some very terrible things that happen to all of us, and they are the result of sin, of destruction and decay in the world around us, of spiritual forces at work in the unseen realm. Right? And I'm not saying God causes those things to happen. What I am saying is this, that even though we go through these incredibly difficult circumstances, even though these are a part of our reality, as followers of Jesus, we can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, knowing that we are under the care of our shepherd, Jesus. The second thing that Jesus tells Peter is not only will he be led, but he will be led where he does not want to go. I love what Henry Nouwen says. He says that maturity for Jesus is being willing to be led where you would rather not go. Right? If you want to know how mature are you, ask yourself this question: how willing are you to be led where you do not want to go? Now, the upside of being led where we don't want to go is that we have the opportunity to give full control of our lives and our souls to the care of Jesus. But the downside is that sometimes, actually many times, we have no idea where this is going to take us, right? Or we're led a place to where we don't really want to go, or we aren't led a place that we would really rather go, right? Many times being in a situation means that we are led into incredibly difficult, uncomfortable, and even sometimes soul and faith trying circumstances. But the invitation by Jesus, in spite of these things, is to follow him through the dark, trying, often confusing circumstances. Because through faith, we believe that death is not the end, that after death comes resurrection and new life. Right? That death to self is followed by what Jesus calls the abundant life. Now, I've been on this journey myself for a few years now, and it's been awkward and difficult and hard to navigate. And about this time last year, a friend of mine actually recommended a book to me that was really incredibly helpful with giving me a vocabulary and a language with which to articulate where I am on the spiritual journey of maturity as a follower of Jesus. Sometimes I felt stuck. Sometimes I felt like I was in a waiting place. But as I began to press into this idea of spiritual formation more, I began to understand that, one, what I was experiencing was normal. And number two, it doesn't have to be the end. In some ways, it can actually be a beginning or a rebirthing of my own spiritual life. The book that was given to me by my friend, or recommended to me by my friend, was a book by Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick, and it's called The Critical Journey. And what it does is it outlines a stage theory paradigm, or 6 stages of spiritual formation, to help us kind of get from point A to point Z, if you will, in the spiritual journey. Now, that said, there are a lot of great resources out there. I'm not saying that this is the only one. This is one that I have found incredibly helpful as I'm trying to map out my own spiritual journey, which is why I'm sharing it with you. Now, what I want to do is I want to kind of give a very brief 30,000 foot view of what the stages are. I want to then kind of dive a little bit deeper into each stage. Then I want to talk about how we can kind of get stuck or transition between stages. Then I want to give a little bit of a personal anecdote at the very end. So just bear with me. If you need to pause this so you can kind of write stuff down, feel free to do that. But I think this information and this stuff is just so incredibly helpful for me, and I'm willing to bet for you at some point in your spiritual journey as well. So here are the 6 stages of the critical journey as defined by the author. Stage 1 is the recognition of God. Stage 2 is the life of discipleship. Stage 3 is the productive life. Stage 4 is the journey inward. After stage 4, before you get to stage 5, the authors talk about something called the wall, which is not really a stage as much as it is like an obstacle or a hurdle that you have to overcome in order to get to stage 5. Stage 5 is the journey outward, and stage 6 is the life of love. So here's a short word on each of these before we keep going. In stage 1, right, the discovery of God. This is honestly, I think it's one of my favorite stages. When I first meet people who are kind of at this stage, they kind of have a lot of sense of awe and wonder, right? This is kind of the recognition, what the authors say at this stage is the recognition that somebody is behind it all, right? That we recognize that our life is more than just evolutionary chance or some sort of chemical reaction, right? That there's more to life than just atoms and, trauma and chaos. There is actually somebody who is navigating and directing. Now, this can come to different people at various stages in life, whether you're 3 years old and praying, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, or whatever, with your parent at night, or whether you're 73 and you're reading the latest research on neuroscience and neurogenesis and astrophysics and all these things, and you're like, oh my gosh, there really is something behind it all. It can occur at various points. It may happen in one flashbang moment, or it may be a steady progression over time where you're kind of pressing into this more and more. It may come from moments of elation, of you see a sunrise, or you experience the beauty of nature and creation, or sometimes it comes from pain where you realize in your trauma you cannot fix yourself and you need God. Now, we move from stage 1 to stage 2 if and when we commit to follow Jesus, right? From this sort of ambiguous, nebulous, there's a higher power of some sort, into a more defined, I believe that it is Jesus of Nazareth, my rabbi, the Son of God, who is calling the shots, who's kind of doing this in my life and in the world around me. And not just that, but then you move into a community of other followers of Jesus. Now, at that point in stage 2, or the life of discipleship, or as we say here, apprenticeship, the authors say this stage is best characterized as a time of learning and belonging, right? We learn most about God by those that we respect and trust, right? We are the learners, not the teachers. And we learn in community from our leaders, hopefully ones that are pointing us to Jesus, from other people, from friends who are maybe a little bit further along in the spiritual journey. I love people at this stage because they tend to devour everything they can in order to grow. Like, man, you listen to this podcast, or you got to read this book, or listen to this preacher, or this pastor, or this new guy who's talking about these things. I just read this blog, right? And they have conversations with leaders and with mentors and with friends. Like, they're very, very their appetite for learning about God is voracious. I mean, they're just so ravenous to learn things. And it's really cool, really beautiful. And I love to be with people on this stage. Now, we move from stage 2, the life of a disciple, to stage 3, the productive life, when we shift from sort of this generalist idea to a discipleship approach. Right? From this is how everybody should follow Jesus. This book was impactful on me. You've got to read it. It's going to be impactful on you too, right? This is how everybody should do it. Right? And we move from that into learning how to take all this knowledge and apply it to our everyday life. Right? We learn more about ourselves, like our skill set, our spiritual gifts. We learn these things, like these natural talents we may have, and then we move from learning about them to applying them into the community of faith and the world around us. I love stage 3 and people who are in stage 3 because, y'all, this is where a lot of good work happens. Right? You see that people who are in stage 3 often develop incredible organizations and ministries that feed the poor. They clothe the homeless. They help people who are in prison. They do a great deal with social justice and standing up against injustice and oppression. Like, you see brilliant and amazing and beautiful things come out of stage 3, which is oftentimes a negative thing because people in stage 3 are so busy. They often get tired, and sometimes, if left unchecked, they burn out because they just get busier and busier. Now, once we kind of get into that phase, we begin then to understand that after stage 3 comes stage 4. And many times we don't move into stage 4 of our own will or volition. Oftentimes what happens is as we move from stage 3 to stage 4, there is a crisis of sorts. There was a change around us, maybe a career change, or maybe there was a change in social or relational status, or maybe even there was a change in the health in our bodies or around us. And what happens is this crisis happens and we experience a great deal of discomfort, of confusion. And sometimes when we fight the transition, we actually plateau in stage 3. And that's what really leads to burnout in the end. Or we regress back into stage 2 or even 1 with awe and wonder and learning more and more and more because we don't really want to move into that uncomfortable stage 4, which is the inward journey. The authors say that the inward journey is a deep and very personal inward journey. It almost comes as an unsettling experience, yet results in healing for those who continue through it. Until now, our journey has had an external dimension to it, right? We're pouring out, right? We're learning from others. It's just this beautiful outward expression. Our life of faith was more visible, more outwardly oriented, but the focus fell more on the outside. But at stage 4, the inward journey, they say we face an abrupt change to almost the opposite mode. And a lot of times when we hit stage 4, this inward journey, our outer world is great. Like there's not been necessarily any major thing that's happened, although sometimes it does, but we kind of begin to ask questions, right? Things around us may be great. Our marriages may be okay. Our kids may be fine. Our health may be good. Our job may be secure. We may, experience certain things in our social life. Like that may be okay, but inwardly, we're just a mess, right? We experience confusion, uncertainty. There's a great deal of doubt and sadness. There's a feeling of loss, of grief, right? There's a lack of clarity or direction, right? You may be dealing with a wound from a relationship or a loss of understanding regarding the circumstances of your life. And then what happens is you then begin to enter into this sort of phase of introspection, right? Lots of thinking, lots of spiritual conversation, lots of asking, what's going on? Why, God? Right? And you're doing this kind of in community with close and trusted friends, right? They say that there is a lot of times in this stage a healing from the past, processing it in the present, and then receiving new dreams for the future, right? And somewhere in stage 4, we hit what the authors call the wall. Now, the wall is it's this pain that you can't get around. It's something that defines your everyday life from that day forward. It's not something you can get out of. It's something that happens to you that becomes a part of your life for the rest of your life. Maybe it's the death of a loved one. Maybe it's being fired from your job. Maybe it's the divorce or a failure of a relationship. I would even say COVID right now, the quarantine for many is what has sort of triggered this wall in their lives. But it's something that comes into our lives, and it's a part of our lives moving forward. We can't erase it. We can't go around it. We can't avoid it. We can't spin it and try to as a 7, like on the Enneagram, you can't reframe it, right? It's simply a part of who you are. All you can do is move through it. It is what the psalmist says in chapter 23, the valley of the shadow of death. What's interesting is when you read scripture, you realize that there are so many people who experience the wall over and over again. Moses, David, Solomon, even Jesus on the cross in his final words. Some of them were, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. You know God's presence is still there, but his felt presence, that feeling, that sense of his closeness is gone. And you just kind of feel this emptiness, this void, the darkness and confusion. Right? And a lot of times, all of us really, I would say, experience pain in our lives. Some experience way more than others, and some experience this pain far earlier in their life than others. And what happens many times is rather than going through the wall, we actually just stop, or we try to get out of it, or we try to numb it through like binge watching Netflix, or eating our feelings, or social media scrolling, or maybe even turning to addiction, some sort of narcotic or alcohol, or even sometimes pouring ourselves and our lives into our careers, thinking that if we can just be busy, we don't have to feel it. And when we do that, when we refuse to push into it to get beyond it, we end up blocking our own spiritual journey, our way forward, our way of forward momentum in the journey of faith becomes stagnant, and we end up getting stalled out. And this wall can come at the beginning of stage 4, the middle, or at the end. It can either cause the journey into stage 4, or it can be the result of the journey into stage 4. But when we get here, we recognize that we can't get around it. And the only way that we can get to stage 5 is when we finally accept the reality of our life, of who we are, with joy. This is my personality type. This is my body image. This is who I am with my failures and the bad and good choices that I've made. This is my family. This is my marriage. These are my kids. This is my singleness. And this is my fill in the blank. It could be anything for you, but we do not move beyond the wall into stage 5 until we accept this is our reality and we accept it with joy. Like so many times, I think the hardest thing that we can do is to actually face reality. Right? Most of us here in the Western world, especially here in America, live in a fantasy world, not reality. But until we actually face and embrace our reality with joy and acceptance, we will never move on to stage 5, which is the outward journey. Once you've gone through the journey inward, you then move into sort of this outward journey of activity. Right? It's this involvement many times in the same things you were involved with in stage 3, being productive and social justice and helping with the marginalized and poverty and feeding. I mean, like you're so many times you're involved in the same things, but from a very different perspective. Right? You're not involved with a sense of trying to prove yourself or earn anything. You are involved from a new centered sense of self. Right? You've been changed. There's this wholeness and awareness of your faults, and you have a fresh desire to be in God's will rather than in your own will. Right? We in this stage 5, experience a great deal of peace because we can endure trials, conflicts, and problems gracefully because our confidence is not in our performance, but is in who God said we are and His control over our lives. Sometimes in stage 5, people change jobs. Sometimes they enter into a new stage of family. But many times what happens is they simply resolve to do what they were doing previously, but with a new re-energized fervor, because it's from a new re-energized motivation. Right? They're less motivated by ego, and they're more motivated by compassion. They care less and less about what other people think and more about other people. They realize that accomplishment and accumulation will not satisfy. They won't fulfill. They won't give you any kind of lasting joy. So they begin to enjoy the accomplishments they already have, the accumulation they already have, and other things because the pressure is off. You can genuinely experience these things with gratitude and joy and humility and pleasure, because you don't need them to be sustained. You're already sustained by the will of God. Right? They recognize these things aren't things. They are gifts. And growth looks more like accepting and resting in the fact that our wounds are a part of our story rather than working and fighting to try and cover them up or overachieve them. People who come this far into the outward journey usually have the blessing of moving into stage 6, which is the life of love. At this stage, we reflect God to the world more clearly and consistently than we ever thought possible, because we realize that the end of our journey is being a person who embodies love. We are the incarnate. To borrow that sort of Latin phrase, we are the incarnate of love to the world. We are at peace with ourselves, fully confident in who God has made us to be. We are like vessels that God pours His Spirit into us. We are Spirit-filled, but not in this sort of arrogant, like super hyper spiritual like religious fanatic way, but we are spirit-filled in a way that is quiet and unassuming and simply loves others for the sake of the fact that they are made in the image of God and God loves them too. I love people who are in this stage. I love being around people who are in this stage, because when people are in this stage, they are just like, they get such great joy out of the little things. Things that you're like, man, like I never would have seen that. Like, wow, that's amazing. Like, and when I'm around them, I feel a deeper sense of peace and happiness and just satisfaction. Like, I love hanging around these people. And usually they are older, though not all older people are in stage 6, the life of love. A lot of times, those who are in that stage are older, because they've become love, right? They embody the compassion of Jesus to everybody they meet. Right? And normally we don't really embody this stage until we have a lot of relationships, many of which have probably failed. Because when we have those failures of relationships, we begin to then ache for a life of love for others who are also experiencing those failures of relationships. We can pour out because of what we've been poured into. Now, a few things about this sort of paradigm, okay, really quickly before we leave. One, no, this is not as linear as it sounds. I know it sounds very much like it's a timeline, like stage 1, stage 2, and so on and so forth. But this is more of like a spiral. Think of like an upward spiral of maturity, right? Sometimes you move forward or upward, and sometimes you kind of regress, or in the language of kind of the old church language of you backslide. Sometimes that we have a stage that we're stuck in for a while, and sometimes we move forward and backwards. The authors actually say that many of us have a home stage, which is a stage that we kind of revert to when we're feeling insecure or we're feeling stressed. Something else about this I want you to note is this. It is entirely possible to be at one stage of maturity in one area of our life, and to have another area of our life that we have yet to surrender to Jesus and his invitation to maturity. Meaning, you may be at stage 5 with this particular relationship, but maybe at stage 2 when it comes to self-awareness, right? And that's okay. Like, but just when we experience those things, a lot of times we feel sort of this like stuckness, right? We feel like we're not really sure, kind of like it feels balanced and a little chaotic. And it's usually because there's not a balance of maturity there. And until those things become on sort of an equal plane, we will not feel like we can really move forward or really even feel stable with where we are. The third thing I want to bring to your attention is that it is so possible to be between stages and stuck in a period of transition. I mean, that is a very real and valid possibility. And I would say that many times that's exactly where we are. You may feel like you can plot exactly where you are. Like, dude, I'm in stage 3. My life is characterized by busyness, of good things for Jesus and doing a lot of things in the church. Or maybe I'm in the phase 2 of stage 2 of like knowledge, or I'm just stage 4. But sometimes we are actually just kind of stuck between stages, or kind of going back and forth. And that's okay, y'all. That's completely okay. The great tragedy, I think, for many people who get stuck is that they never actually move forward and get unstuck. Now, what the authors do at this point is they actually give a great deal of advice of what to do when you feel like you're stuck or in transition, and how to move forward in the midst of it. So I just kind of want to hit on those really, really quickly. If somebody's stuck in stage 1, a lot of times it's because they haven't joined a community, and they never move from this sort of ignorance to just this nebulous of something out there to more of a specific place of learning, right? From a higher power, the man upstairs, or whatever you call him, to, no, I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, and whatever that means. People who get stuck at stage 2, a lot of times it's because all they have is black and white thinking, right? It's sort of this rigid, self-righteous sort of us versus them, whoever they are type of mentality, right? We're the good guys and they're the bad guys, right? And usually the bad guys are people who disagree with you philosophically, politically, spiritually, theologically, whatever, right? And I see this on both sides, right? I see this on the conservative fundamental right, and I also see this on the hyper intellectualized left. I mean, both sides and everybody in between are guilty of this sort of us versus them type of mentality. But people in this stage, the authors say, when they get stuck here, they tend to kind of fall into one of two camps. The first camp is what they call the switchers, right? And the idea behind the switchers are people who move from group to group, or they move from church to church, or leader to leader, or philosophy to philosophy, generally because they get involved and they're incredibly excited at the front end. They're like, yes, I'm all in. And then they come across something that maybe they don't like or they don't agree with. And so they're like, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to go over here. Yeah, and just a quick word to you. Like, if this is you, like, let me just say this as a pastor to you. There is an idealism that exists in all of us that nobody can live up to, including yourself. Right? No church has it all together. No political party has it all together. No social movement has it all together. No leader, including me, I know, shocker, has it all together. And until we actually embrace this, we will continue to move from thing to thing to thing. We'll be a switcher, and then we'll be stuck, and we will not mature in the spiritual life. The other type of person who gets stuck here at stage 2 is what they call the searchers. And it's people who, honestly, they have a great deal of knowledge about the spiritual life. Like maybe they grew up in it, but at some point, there was a religious wound or trauma that they've not fully received healing from. Those who experience this often slip into what one author calls DIY religion, do-it-yourself religion, where they're like, you know what? I love Jesus. I love the things that he taught, things he stood for. So I'm going to borrow that. But I also love what Buddha had to say about some things over here. I love what the social justice movement has to say about this. I'm going to pull that in. And they kind of begin to borrow from a lot of different sources to sort of create this kind of conglomeration of religious beliefs or ideals, right? They're not necessarily hostile to Jesus. Matter of fact, a lot of them would say they affirm Jesus and a lot of things that he said, but because of a woundedness in the church or from the church or religion or something, they're just simply done. I was talking to a new dear friend of mine the other day who is an incredible musician, and he was wanted by a lot of different churches because of his skill set and his giftings. And we were just having a spiritual conversation, and I just asked him, I said, what's your story? And he said, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I'm tired of church leaders using my skill set as a commodity to build their religious empire, so I am done with organized religion. That absolutely broke my heart. And honestly, y'all, a lot of people, you may not recognize this, but that right there characterizes a lot of people who are living in our community here at East Nashville, or who are living in what we would call more progressive cities. People who feel like, man, that I want to believe in the church. I really had a lot of optimism and hope, but right now I just feel largely disappointed because of promises that were unkept, or maybe even the fact that I felt like I was more used for what I could do for the church rather than the fact that I was created in the image of God to know and reflect and grow in him. And that just absolutely breaks my heart. And y'all, just to be honest, there's a great deal of my own life where I'm working through this. I grew up in a phenomenal family, a family that loves Jesus and taught me to love the things of Jesus. But there are a lot of things that I saw in the church as a whole growing up that I've just really been wrestling with. Like, how do you marry a passion for people with the idea of Scripture and what Jesus has to say about things without some sort of tradition hijacking these things? Right? How do you balance faith and science? I think a lot of times we just don't do this really well. And these are things that I wrestle with sometimes as a searcher, right? And I'll just say this, if this is you, or if this is somebody that you know, we should all feel the freedom to, and allow others to have the freedom to ask questions, wrestle with doubts, and to say scary things like, I don't know. I have so many friends who are in this phase that my heart is just, this is where my heart is. And I think that they're in this phase, I think, unnecessarily, because they began to ask They began to feel doubt, to question things, and the Christians around them didn't know what to say and got a little scared. And so they just simply said, well, I'm going to pray for you. And then they left. Right? I had one friend say to me lately, I'm so tired of people telling me that they are praying for my soul, but won't have an honest conversation about what I'm feeling and why I'm feeling this way. Many times you can characterize this as sort of a deconstruction phase. And deconstruction, y'all, can actually be very helpful if it's followed by reconstruction. Like deconstruction on your own with your friends who are also angry at the church is not going to be helpful for you, right? You're going to get stuck. You're going to stall out. But deconstruction that's happening in a community with other people who can sit and listen and work through this with you can be beautiful, because then you can actually begin to enter into a reconstruction phase. And I've met so many people, especially older people, who I think are in this deconstruction phase and have never moved on into reconstruction. And what often happens to them is that they are characterized by bitterness, by frustration, by anger, by sadness, by loneliness. And generally they're people that you're like, man, I have a hard time being around them because they just complain about everything all the time. And it's certainly not the way of love. Now, I spent a lot of time on stage 2, and I apologize, but that's where I feel like a lot of us are, and a lot of people in our community are moving on quickly to stage 3. People who are in stage 3, they get stuck when they are run more by ambition than by obedience, right? When they put their desires in front of God's desires, right? When they're all about living out the kingdom of God by doing because they are trying to get over some sort of insecurity of their own, rather than pressing into this because it's what God has commanded them to do. Stage 4, people oftentimes get stuck at stage 4, the journey inward, when they are paralyzed by fear or doubt. And they get stuck in sort of this introspection, self-looking way, and they never move through deconstruction and doubt into reconstruction and life. In stage 5, the authors actually say that they don't really get stuck in stage 5, which is great. If you can hang on for stages 1 through 4 and push through the wall, you get to stage 5, congratulations, like you've won, right? Like that's kind of the sweet spot, stage 5. And some of us, honestly, y'all, through all of this are able to define where we are, and some of us can't. Right? Sometimes we feel like we're on this sort of carousel of trying to figure all this out, and we are in what Pete Scazzaro calls the confusing in between. Right? We can be in a series of transitions, and transitions can be scary and uncomfortable, but they can also be so good for our spiritual journey. Because these transitions, these hard places, are places where Jesus invites us to grow into a deeper level of trust and maturity. I love what one pastor said recently. He said, none of us mature without aging, but so many of us age without maturing. Like, that is so true. In America, most of us never move beyond the productive stage of stage 3, right? We live in this sort of shallow, superficial culture of achievement. And it's not hard to allow it to form us into shallow, superficial people. Right? Remember Jordan Peterson, as we talked about last week, he says that we are the average of the people that we spend time with. So if you're spending time around people who are trying to achieve in order to cover up their own insecurity, and so they're shallow and superficial, guess what's going to happen to you? You are going to end up adopting those same tendencies in your life. Now, as we're wrapping up, let me just give you a few closing thoughts on the wall, that kind of in between 4 and 5 stage. Let me just say this. Every single person comes to the wall. Many of us come to it multiple times over the course of our life. Again, it could be something that causes it, or it could just be something that we stumble into. And for those of you who are at the wall right now, let me just say a few things. First, I'm sorry. Can we just agree that this part of the journey is hard? It hurts. It feels dark and lonely and confusing, and it's not anything I would wish on anybody. I mean, just full transparency, this is where I am right now. About a year ago, I kind of began in going to stage 4 with the inward journey, and I hit a wall a few months ago, and gosh, I've just kind of been in this season, and it stinks. It is so hard. It's not what I want. It's not where I want to be. It's difficult. Now, externally, things are great. Like my family is healthy. Like my kids are enjoying life. We're spending a lot more time together. It's beautiful. My communication with my wife is at an all-time high. Like we're experiencing some good things. But inwardly, y'all, it's chaos. And I feel like I'm just a mess. I feel pain and grief and loss. And at times it feels more like regressing than progressing. But it's actually what I'm discovering is more of an awareness of my own immaturity and lack of satisfaction with my personality type, the skills that I wish I had that I don't have, the ability to do certain things that I wish I could do that I don't feel like I do well. It's trying to get over certain things that I've been taught to believe that I'm now going, I don't really know what I feel about that. And it's just been hard. But what I've discovered in this is that this is an invitation by Jesus to experience the deepest growth, not the quickest, but the deepest amount of growth. In saying yes to this, in pressing into this, I'm experiencing what I would probably say is the deepest level of pain emotionally that I've ever experienced. But I believe that pushing through it rather than trying to run away from it or go around it or simply ignore it, I believe that pushing through it is going to lead to the other side where there's going to be radical healing. Not naively saying, oh, it's going to all be okay and all you got to do is hope and believe, but to say, I'm going to press into this. And in the midst of it, even though it's not okay, like I'm going to be fine. Like I'm okay, even though it's hard, and pushing into it. And this is the part of this journey, if you're there with me, that James talks about in chapter 1, starting in verse 2, where he says, consider it joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of various kinds. That's the wall, right? Because you know that the testing of your faith, this wall experience, will produce endurance. Let endurance have its full effect so that you may be mature and complete, and get this, lacking in nothing. That's exactly what I want in my life. I want to not lack anything. But to get that, I have to go through, and you have to go through and not run away from or try to numb or regress into something other than the wall at whatever stage you may be in your life. So here's the question I have for you. Where are you on this journey? If you could put a pen in one of those 6 stages or even the wall, where would you put that pen? And let me just ask you this. The second question behind that is where do you feel stuck? Where do you feel like maybe there's an imbalance in your stages, your lack of, or your progression of maturity? And what would it look like for you to get unstuck in those areas? Maybe it's admitting or going deeper into community, or maybe it's just simply pressing into it and allowing God to work in you for His good pleasure. Regardless of where you are, know you are not alone. You are seen by God and by me. And let me too invite you onto this journey with us as we begin to meet again next week and the weeks after that, to just explore what this means for you wherever you are on this journey. But until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you His peace as you are on the critical journey of spiritual formation.
Count on one thing, the same God who never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out, working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. count on one thing. The same God who never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out, working all things out. Oh yeah, yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy all my days. Oh yes, I will. I choose to praise, glorify, glorify the name of all names. Nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, glorify, glorify the name of all names. Nothing can stand against. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy all my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will. And I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. And I wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. And we sing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sin and my sorrow.